There's no question who did the shooting of Trayvon Martin. The only question is whether it's second-degree murder or not. Now, you've seen the information that's been filed in this case. You've heard us talk about it in an opening statement, and you've seen the legal language. Did kill Trayvon Martin with evidence of a depraved mind? Well, haven't we all at some time in our life talked about, oh, he just wasn't in his right mind? That doesn't mean that the defendant was insane. It just means that when he was talking or when he was acting, he simply wasn't acting the way he should have been under the circumstances. That's what I want you to be concerned about as I talk to you now, and as you go back in this jury room and decide this particular case. The defendant was a member of a Citizens Watch group. This is a volunteer organization. They're not paid, and most importantly, they don't carry guns. But the defendant decided that he would carry a gun. Why? We'll never know. But nobody else did. Citizens Watch people do not carry guns. Number one. Number two, when the defendant encountered Trayvon Martin was walking down the street and the defendant was in his car. Now, when he got out of his car, the defendant, and started approaching Trayvon Martin, he was overstepping his bounds. Because we all know, and the defendants admitted it, that he's supposed to stay in his car, go down the street, look for things that look suspicious, like the eyes and ears of the police department, and then call the non-emergency hotline. In fact, you even heard it in one of the tapes that was introduced into evidence. The defendant calls the non-emergency hotline after he's already gotten out of his car and started to go after the defendant. He calls the non-emergency hotline and they ask him, "Are you following him?" And he says, "Yeah." And he says, "We don't need for you to be doing that." Now, I heard Mr. Martin, Trayvon's father, that 17-year-old child, when he testified, he said, "I'd just like to know why the defendant got out of his car and started following my son." Well, I'll tell you why, Mr. Martin. I heard you. It's because he was overstepping his bounds, he wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, and that is evidence of a depraved mind. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the defendant wasn't wearing any type of identifying clothing, didn't have any type of a cap, say, or a badge, or some type of even a coat that says Auxiliary Police Department. All he had was his gun. So he wasn't identifying himself to Trayvon Martin. He just started following this 17-year-old child. So when Trayvon Martin found out that he was pursuing him, that he was following him, he called his best friend, Ms. Genty, the last person to ever talk to him before he died, and said to her, "There's some cracker following me." He didn't know who he was. Wasn't identified. He wasn't identified. He didn't have any type of coat or gun or anything other than his gun. All he said was, "Why are you here?" Well, why are you here? I mean, who are you? We don't know, because you didn't identify yourself. There again, he was overstepping his bounds, evidence of depraved mind. The reason there was evidence of depraved mind, you remember it from one of the recordings that came in, those fucking punks, those assholes always get away. This is not a man who's acting in a clear, calm, rational mind. This is a man who's acting under stress. Now let's talk about stress for a second. In a police department, you don't even get into a police department without doing psychological testing and going to their version of boot camp, which is the academy. And what they do there is they're trying to see how you're going to react under stress. Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, never went through any of that, so obviously he was not taking stress well. He just kept following the defendant, even though he was told not to. Then he turned around, and at this point in time, this child, Trayvon Martin, had no idea who this cracker was that was following him. So if he did turn around and say to him, why are you following me, and then punch him in the nose, it was actually Trayvon Martin who was acting in self-defense, not the defendant. Because here's this person, he doesn't know who he is, all he knows is he's got a gun, and he's saying, why are you here? Well, Trayvon Martin acted just as anybody else in that situation would have done, and he's the one who acted in self-defense. If he did punch the defendant in the mouth and put him on the ground, well, that's too bad, because the defendant overstepped his bounds. The defendant was out there playing cops and robbers, not being a citizens auxiliary or neighborhood watch type person just reporting on suspicious activity. He was trying to play cops and robbers because he wanted to be a policeman, and he wasn't acting in his right mind when he did it. He was trying to be a cop when he wasn't a cop, playing cops and robbers with a gun that was a real gun, shot real bullets, and could kill somebody. So, whatever happened after that is really the fault of the defendant. He had no right to be pulling his gun because he shouldn't have been there in the first place. He had no right to shoot his gun because he shouldn't have been there in the first place. If he had just done what he was told to do, just as Mr. Martin, that child's father, asked, well, why did he get out of his car and start chasing my son? Well, the defendant, he's got to live with that, because what he did was totally unauthorized. He overstepped his bounds. He did what he shouldn't have been doing, and as a result, we have a 17-year-old child who is dead now, unnecessarily, if the defendant had just done what he was supposed to do. That phrase that the defendant said, those fucking punks, they're always getting away with anything, those assholes. If a policeman had made that statement, he'd be off the force, or at the very least, he would have to go through some kind of disciplinary training. Not so with the defendant, because he just decided that he was going to play cops and robbers with a real gun without having to have the responsibility of a police officer. Well, this is why we have such things as psychological testing and the academy to try to determine if people that are out there in guns, in badges, in uniforms, if they're going to act properly under stress, and if they're going to properly execute the laws, enforce the laws, and do their jobs properly. Years ago, back in 1968, many of us, I know I am, old enough to remember what happened at the Democratic Convention when the police overreacted. We know what happened, we saw it, and the protesters said at the time, the whole world's watching, the whole world's watching. Well, ladies of the jury, the whole world is watching now. At this point, you are the ones that are going to determine if the defendant acted correctly or not. I say to you, he acted with a depraved mind based on everything that we've told you. So I ask you to think about the defendant's actions out there, what he did, what led up to the shooting. Think about it. When you go back in the jury room, talk about it. I'm asking you to return a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder, as said in the information, and then we'll talk about the penalty, whether the defendant should spend the rest of his life in prison after that.